Veteran's dog discovered a buried armored truck. What it revealed shocked the entire town. Elias's hands dug until his knuckles went white, each tug unearthing a decade folded inside the mud, while Varg, taut and watchful, traced the air with a nose that knew more truths than any witness. A recent flood had yanked at the ravine and bared a seam of metal platework riveted like an old coffin, unnatural among roads and moss. He levered the slab, surrendered with a blasted sigh, releasing a vapor that tasted of stale money and buried oaths. Light from his flashlight fell across a shape at once mechanical and desecrated, a curved hull pocked with rust, hinges swollen, a reinforced door half bitten by earth. Varg's hair rose along his spine, and a sound like a low engine note trembled in the hollow where birds had gone mute. Elias brushed aside sod and found a finger-thick groove of something stuck between twisted metal, brass dulled by time. A small lighter scored with initials no one in Harmony Creek would freely speak aloud. The discovery felt like an accusation aimed at the town itself, a private object placed now on public soil. He remembered nights in uniform when officers folded truth into neat files, and watched men with power smile through lies. He remembered faces at the diner that tightened when certain names slipped into conversation. Rainwater trickled through the opening and exposed a darker scent, a chemical tang that hinted at more than cash, at violence taped over with silence. Varg nosed deeper and backed away, teeth bared at an unseen edge. Elias's breath fogged, a question swelling colder than the mist. Who had buried this here and why? What secret had been walled into earth and sleep for decades? And which living people in Harmony Creek would do anything to keep it buried? What happened next will shock you. Elias moved through the fir and maple stand like a man relearning rhythm, every footfall deliberate against the constant of memory. Autumn stitched the hills into layered bands of copper and ochre that brushed his sleeves as he passed, and the air carried sap, loam, and the distant hiss of creek water. Varg matched his pace with patient confidence, the dog's muscles tight and alert beneath a coat that kept the sheen of disciplined conditioning. Elias breathed slowly to keep breath from rattling the quiet. He had chosen these woods for solitude and small rituals, mornings with strong coffee, while fog clung low, evenings reading by lamplight, until sleep softened like surrender. War taught him how to measure danger and to count losses, lessons he folded beneath routines and the steady gravity of companionship. Varg's presence smoothed edges. The past had made jagged, head resting once against Elias's thigh, in a gesture that felt like a benediction against old noise. They crossed a narrow draw gouged by last week's flood, where water stripped undergrowth and left roots exposed like skeletal fingers. At the rim a hollow hung in the soil, a curvature that no root or stone had made. Varg stopped and fixed the depression with a gaze that named wrongness, rigid as a sentinel. Elias crouched and let his fingers brush the surface. Mud yielded, then clung, ribbons of sod peeling away in thin sheets. A dull flash met his nail like a small reluctant memory. He worked by habit and patience, scraping moss with the butt of his knife, clearing clods into a growing ring, while careful not to disturb the geometry beneath. Human design revealed itself in seams that met at right angles, bolts threaded through plates, a flange suggesting a hat. The object lay half swallowed, skin folded into the earth, pocked with pitted rivets where decades had eaten metal. Elias pushed aside a slab of sod and exposed a curved rim, rimmed with fasteners. The metal felt cold beneath his fingertips despite damp air. Varg nosed a depression and emitted a short, tight sound. The dog's pupils caught the beam and flashed intelligence older than mere training. They cleared more, hauling wet leaves and sod into piles that darkened in the afternoon shade, while Elias kept a steady rhythm, each motion measured to preserve evidence. The aperture widened, and a scent rose, not only iron and oil, but a deeper rot that slid along the back of his throat and left a metallic tang. He tasted old money and older grief in that odor, enough to make his jaw tight. Once in Harmony Creek's library, he had skimmed brittle microfilm, late into a winter night, when curiosity nudged him. Clara Hensley had shown an article clipped from an autumn decades gone, an armored truck missing, guards gone, columns folding rumor into tidy facts, and then into silence. That brittle clipping returned now like a compass needle. Elias set a small stone to mark his worked edge, and thought about process. Digging without plan would scatter evidence and invite trouble. so he tied cord to forked sticks and marked a perimeter. Varg lay with head on paws and eyes half closed, but wholly attentive, every inch of the dog tuned to wood and man. Elias took out a compact notebook and logged coordinates, visible seams, depth estimates, the glint of brass glimpsed beneath silt, and the smell that would not dismiss itself. He suspected intentional concealment, not an accidental carcass lost to time. Someone had chosen this hollow and hidden this thing with purpose, and purpose carries motive. The thought lodged like a stone. Discovery here would pry at lids that preferred being closed. As afternoon shifted toward dusk, Elias built a modest ring for a light and boiled coffee, watching steam lift thin and honest while the forest threaded into blue. He thought of Harmony Creek as embers rose, a town small enough to cradle secrets between people and large enough for certain names to still seal lips. Roy Baxter might turn away when some topic surfaced, smiles tightening to wire when old favors held sway. Elias had learned to move with measured intent. Military training taught him restraint and procedure rather than spectacle. He decided to gather facts and not accusations, to consult people inclined to truth rather than those invested in silence. Morning broke with mist clinging to trunks and a sky washed pale. Dew beaded at Varg's whiskers, and urgency settled like iron in Elias's ribs. They returned to the aperture with tools packed and clarity sharpened by sleep, and Elias eased more earth aside, until the hatch's seams spoke of bolted closure and hinges built to endure force. Pressed between warped metal and silt, he found a small intimate object, with brass dulled to a quiet sheen, a lighter engraved faintly with initials that suggested a name, and therefore a human story. He turned the lighter in gloved fingers, noting corrosion patterns and shallow script, because trivial objects often tethered larger truths. Those initials traced tentative lines in his mind to faces he might meet at the diner, to ledgers and favors and sudden changes in fortune. He catalogued the item carefully, photographed it methodically, and stored it in a sealable bag, labeled with coordinates and time. Varg paced then returned, pressing close, as if to lend counsel, without word. Later, wrapped against chill and carrying a slow resolve, Elias walked a ridge toward Harmony Creek to buy supplies, letting questions arrange themselves like peeled bark ready to expose the wood beneath. At the diner he kept tone casual, while scanning faces for microshifts. People's eyes told stories mouths might not. Roy Baxter offered small talk, until Elias steered conversation toward historical oddities, whereupon the owner's jaw tightened, and his hands clenched around a coffee cup with unnecessary force. A silence swelled, loud as a denial, signaling that some histories lived by omission rather than acknowledgement. Elias let it sit and moved on to Clara at the library, where light pooled over microfilm trays and catalog cards. She listened with an expression that balanced caution and curiosity and brought out brittle issues stacked in careful order. Together they traced headlines to names, and names to ledger entries, showing suspicious transfers and sudden spikes in wealth among those tied to local authority. Clara's brows furrowed at a particular entry, and she spoke quietly of a deputy who left the force with charm and timing, whose ascent to prominence had benefited some, and baffled others. The map of favors and quiet violence folded into view, each revealed thread pulling Elias deeper into a pattern woven with omission. Back at the field the aperture waited, dark and mute, and Elias understood that earth had swallowed more than metal. It had ingested a story that might not remain buried if unearthed. He tightened his pack, checked his radio, and secured evidence in sealable bags, handling each item with respect for the truth it could unfold. Varg nosed his boot, and offered a quick, approving woof as if consenting to the work ahead. Elias left the woods that day with pockets heavier and posture straighter, carrying questions that would demand records, witnesses, and perhaps danger. He had come seeking peace and found instead a responsibility that sat beside him as real as any companion. The sort of duty requiring patience, courage, and the clarity to separate rumor from fact. Elias knelt with palms pressed to damp earth, and listened to a quiet that had lived a long time, between root and stone. Varg lounged but never relaxed, head lifting when wind shifted, nostrils working the air with an intelligence that had saved them both before. The exposed metal had been revealed by flood and time, a curved flank of riveted armor, whose surface had once borne polish and now wore lichen, as if nature had tried to forgive human violence. Elias set his jaw and began the slow, exact work of freeing a thing from soil, levering sod and easing out clinging roots with movements measured by habit and necessity. Each pull yielded small proofs of manufacture, bolt patterns interrupted by corrosion, a hinge recessed beneath packed earth, a seam so tight only stubborn force would part it. His flashlight found worn upholstery, traces of insulation, the outline of a hatch designed to close the world away. Varg nosed at a rim and whuffed a sound that meant caution. The dog refused to enter a place the animal had learned, spoke danger through silence. Elias had carried procedural discipline as a private library, ways to photograph for preservation, to bag evidence without losing context, to note coordinates in a field log that might someday speak inside a room where facts outweighed rumor. He mounted a tripod and captured angles that preserved scale, logged times and weather, and sketched the hatch perimeter in inked lines that would survive damp. Each action was a small promise to truth and to those who might need it later. When his fingers brushed metal and found a glint of brass beneath a curled strip of upholstery, he felt the scene shift. The lighter lay like a relic, its face stamped with initials SH. Personal artifacts made anonymous wreckage into human story. A token carried accusation by implication. Elias cupped the object in a gloved hand, examined corrosion patterns and shallow script, then sealed it in a labeled pouch. Light moved through the canopy and painted the steel with fleeting highlights, making the structure appear less like wreckage and more like deliberately placed concealment. He ran scenarios through his head: heavy transport teams, decisions to hide rather than file, men who bent rules for profit or protection. Names arranged themselves into possible patterns: favors, ledger entries, sudden rises in comfort. The Ozarks provided camouflage as well as beauty. Coppered leaves and lichen-clad trunks made a graceful mask for whatever commerce had been buried here. Elias felt the double world he now inhabited, the wild, spare honesty and the human economy of omission, where silence could be bought or enforced. He worked through the afternoon with methodical patience, photographing fragments at varied exposures, bagging items with numbered tags, and annotating each entry in a notebook. Shell casings, fabric stiff with rot, and a warped metal folder yielded papers that time had not wholly erased. Ink surfaced in places when exposed to different lights, revealing ledger entries and a faint emblem that matched a stamp found on a loose sheet. These small proofs coalesced into a map: transfers credited to obscure accounts, transport contracts signed by deputies, now retired, an absence in official files that smelled of erasure. Elias's hands moved without hurry, though his chest tightened. The rhythm of work steadied him. Varg's posture shifted to urgent insistence when the dog registered approaching disturbance, not the rustle of small animals, but the distant hum of modern tires and diesel. Elias froze and listened until the sound clarified. The forest answered with a hollow that suggested distance was shortening. He packed evidence with quiet efficiency, tied discrete markers to branches and left a sealed note tucked in a weatherproof tube, instructing that a specific federal contact be notified if the marker persisted for 48 hours. It was a safeguard against small-town pressures that might prefer explanation deferred indefinitely. On a ridge overlooking Harmony Creek, Elias watched the town settle into evening light, porches glowing and a diner sign cutting the dark. From this distance it looked ordinary, the kind of place where histories could be folded into polite conversation, and where certain names could close doors simply by being mentioned. He carried the lighter in a shielded pouch to the diner, scanned faces for microshifts, and mentioned a missing convoy from decades past in casual tones. To test responses, Roy Baxter's handshake tightened, talk thinned at a table and smiles became practice. People avoided eye contact when pasts brushed close to present comforts. Clara Hensley welcomed him to the library, with the quiet competence of someone who knew how to find what time tried to hide. In a dim room of reels and brittle stacks, she ran microfilm while Elias laid out photographs. They tracked a clipped notice from 1987 about an armored truck that never reached its destination, and found ledger notes that hinted at beneficiaries whose names correlated with later prosperity. The lighter's initials matched a surname that recurred like a watermark in accounts and property transfer. Each cross-reference tightened the net of implication. What had been a buried object became evidence that connected to living people who might not welcome scrutiny. Night at camp felt thin and focused. Elias cleaned tools, reviewed images until bolt patterns were memorized, and rehearsed steps for securing chain of custody. He knew the difference between righteous exposure and reckless provocation. Varg's warm weight pressed against his ankle. The dog's steady breath kept the veteran tethered to the present, to small comforts that smoothed harsher edges. They were linked by habits born of service, attention to detail, commitment to truth, and an aversion to panic. Morning came ramming the exposed metal with frost, lending brittle clarity to surfaces that had hidden themselves under damp. Elias prepared for a careful return to the hatch, more photographs, methodical recovery of documents, and securing of physical evidence that would force conversations otherwise deferred. He understood the stakes. People would move to protect fortunes if those fortunes were built upon buried deeds and quieted crimes. He also understood his responsibility, a weight that settled beside him as real as any pack he carried. He shouldered his pack, pocketed the sealed evidence bag, and moved down the ridge toward a town that might prefer questions unasked. He knew the path ahead would demand true courage, patience, and the willingness to confront dangerous loyalty. Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt like it was meant for you to find? Share your story in the comments. Your discovery might inspire others. Elias returned to camp at dusk, lighter wrapped and weighed by thought. He packed gear with military care, batteries checked, photographs cataloged, evidence bagged, while Varg ran perimeter, alert to scent and track. Sleep came in shards. He woke before first light, with the lighter's initials like a small accusation lodged under his ribs. He drove into Harmony Creek, along a ribbon of gravel, where maples flamed and porch lights blinked awake. The town assembled itself in simple motions. A diner sign buzzed, a church bell cleared morning, and neighbors traded small courtesies. Clara Hensley waited in the library amid stacks and reel machines, hands stained from decades of newsprint. Elias unwrapped the lighter and set photographs on the table. Clara slid microfilm reels into place, and read with the slow focus of someone used to coaxing truth from brittle columns. They scoured issues until a clipping surfaced. An October 1987 notice, reporting an armored truck that failed to arrive and 2 guards listed missing. The company issued a terse statement citing an investigation and offered no follow-up. Cargo insured for $4 million shifted the discovery from oddity to crime. Elias photographed the clipping, noting headlines, bylines, and dates. Clara guided him through municipal archives, and together they mapped sudden transfers, unexpected resignations, and bank entries that stuck out like fresh knots in a weathered fence. They moved beyond headlines to microfiche and ledger scraps, assembling a lattice of transactions that suggested motive. A grocery supplier received a large deposit within months. A deputy resigned quietly and later appeared at ribbon cuttings in a new suit. Land parcels changed hands and flowed through accounts that left tangles when traced. None of these items alone screamed conspiracy. Together they sketched a design. At the Creekside Diner, Elias tested reactions by mentioning storms and washouts before easing toward the missing convoy. Conversation thinned. Roy Baxter's smile tightened, regulars fell silent mid-bite, and a mechanic who usually bantered tucked his chin. The room felt smaller, as if the town had practiced in unison the art of diversion. Elias watched faces for micro-shifts, an eye that flicked away, a cough that masked a throat cleared with effort, and he catalogued responses with the same attention he used on evidence. The town's silence revealed texture, not mere absence of speech, but a language of avoidance that protected names and reputations. Documents deepened suspicion. He found a deferred audit misfiled in a folder that should have reconciled accounts, and a memo marked confidential that had been mislaid amid a reorganization. A municipal emblem matched a wax impression discovered in the vault. Signature styles aligned across envelopes and stamped form. He visited a retired county clerk who tended a vegetable patch behind a white fence, and kept paper copies of things official systems had allowed to slip away. The man spoke in halting candor about pages removed and entries cleaned during administrative shuffle. He handed Elias photocopies showing deposits rerouted through minor accounts, and signatures that echoed the looped script on stationery. The clerk's memory was an uneasy map of quiet compromises. Elias felt a pattern emerging: access, motive, and the means to mask both. That evening, headlights paused on road bends, a touch too long, and a pickup idled near the edge of town where drivers should have moved on. Boots left marks near his campsite that suggested a slow, careful sweep rather than random passing. He did not react with panic. He reinforced perimeter alarms, set soft tripwires that would warn without harming, and copied files to encrypted storage off-site. Varg slept with one ear rotating like a tiny radar, offering warmth and steady presence in a place suddenly crowded with watchful shadow. Returning to the hatch at dawn, Elias used quieter tools cushioned to prevent rattling, pried at seams and photographed every fragment. Insulation and stained fabric yielded to his methodical patience. A fractured case had been tamped down and arranged to compress content into an unrecognizable mass. He carefully exposed pages and stamped each image with coordinates and beneath debris he found an envelope sealed with wax. Its impression under magnification matched an emblem used on municipal stationery. The looped script on the seal aligned with a signature from a ledger received from the retired clerk. Those matches moved the lighter from curiosity to pivot, an object that humanized wreckage and connected metal to name. Back at Clara's, lamplight pooled over stacks of documents arrayed like terrain to be traversed. She traced recurring initials in payment columns and pointed to entries where contract amounts ballooned inexplicably. The gathered evidence suggested an engineered disappearance presented as disaster, followed by discreet redistribution. Clara's voice dropped when she noted how small towns often postponed hard questions for the sake of peace, and how money sometimes lubricated silence. Elias organized materials into numbered packets, mindful that suspicion differed from proof and that procedural rigor would matter later. News traveled in crooked channels: at the barber's, in a church pew, along the counter where gossip and prayer shared a seat. Rumor crawled slowly where power and profit intersected and hardened into defensive posture when it touched vested interest. Elias felt lines forming, those who might speak and those who would close ranks. He listed allies: Clara, a few quietly observant patrons, and a distant archivist who owed a favor. He planned to corroborate paper trails with living testimony and to involve parties beyond local influence so the truth could not be folded away. Elias spent the next 2 days stitching fragments of record into a single narrative. Microfilm yielded a shipping note with a line redacted. A municipal ledger showed a contractor receiving an unusual advance, and a bank record tied a company vehicle purchase to a shell account, linked by initials. Each artifact alone might have read as coincidence. Together they suggested At the diner, Elias overheard a complaint about a late delivery, then watched a man lean across a table and bluntly halt the conversation when a name. He mapped social currency: who bought silence with favors, who repaid loyalty with contracts, how civic routine masked transactions that could be ugly if examined closely. Clara agreed to miscatalogue copies of the most sensitive papers while a retired clerk consented to forward originals to a contact elsewhere. They treated danger like equipment to be managed rather than a story to be feared. Elias understood that exposure would not only incriminate individuals, but unsettle the quiet mechanisms that kept Harmony Creek functioning. The lighter's initials, once a curious artifact, now connected to ledgers and signatures and to faces he had seen tightening at the diner. He felt the gravity when a fact ripened into consequence: a man's name linked to money, a ledger entry that shifted alliances, and a town learning to close ranks against inquiry. The discovery had become a lever. Elias realized the town's silence was active and organized, not accidental. He left with copies secured in multiple places, Varg alert at his side, and a plan assembled with the same care he used in the field: corroborate entries against witness accounts, secure outside oversight to prevent local capture, and prepare for resistance. The lighter's initials had cracked a lid. What lay beneath would demand patience, allies, and the willingness to face those who preferred their past remain buried. Back at camp, Elias found a hunting knife, plunged blade first into the weathered table, where he had spread maps and a field notebook. The weapon planted with a clarity that left no doubt about intent. Firelight glanced off steel and the sight settled cold against his ribs. Varg rose at once, body coiled, breath held, a low warning vibrating through his chest. Elias moved with studied economy, hands steady from habit, though his mind catalogued contingencies and probabilities. He kept his voice low and his movements purposeful, refusing spectacle while preparing to respond. He walked the perimeter with a lamp, studying impressions in mud and leaf litter. Tread depth and pattern matched heavy boots. Prints formed deliberate arcs that suggested observers had paced the camp rather than merely passed. Elias photographed each impression, sealed soil samples in evidence bags, and labeled every marker with time and coordinates. A fragment of mesh clung to a thorn, and a torn strap bore a faded emblem. To most, these items would read as debris. To him, they were lids. Tiny prints in a larger pattern. He logged them in a field notebook, careful to preserve context. Under a slate sky, he shifted camp before midnight to a higher knoll, with broader sightlines and fewer places for concealment. He set tripwires at ankle height and rigged them to a portable alarm salvaged from earlier deployments. The lines would warn without maiming. Each knot was tested until tension and slack responded predictably. Varg patrolled like a practice sentinel, nose low and feet whispering over moss, pausing at faint tire impression. Elias knelt and read the depressions like terrain, noting weight, axle spacing, and tread pattern consistent with a heavy all-terrain vehicle. A heavy vehicle implied organization and intent, not a lone opportunist. Distant engines thrummed through the soil that night, vibrations that set teeth on edge and signaled watchers marking proximity. Elias tightened watches, configured staggered rest cycles, and monitored radio channels for chatter. He moved into town at first light, with questions phrased for casual delivery, testing responses without revealing his hand. Roy Baxter's grin stiffened when deliveries came up. A regular at the counter cut a complaint short as someone leaned in. The diner's easy banter folded into small silences and careful gestures, a language of omission protecting certain names. Elias cataloged facial shifts and micro-reactions, building a list of potential allies and cautious witnesses. Back at the hatch, he worked with soft tools to avoid rattling loose evidence, photographing fragments and bagging documents that, once dry and gently unfurled, revealed faint ledger entries and routing notes. A wax impression on an envelope matched municipal seals Clara had shown him, signatures aligned with names that echoed in transferred deeds. The lighter's initials anchored metal to a human story, a tangible thread connecting buried steel to living people who might find exposure costly. Each cross-reference turned coincidence into pattern. Later surveillance footage stunned him. A discreet camera had caught 3 figures moving with practiced ease toward the ravine at dusk. One knelt and worked on a seam while the others kept watch, their tools flashing in brief bands under hoods. Their handling was efficient, practiced, people accustomed to speed and stealth. The footage suggested either a recovery operation or a coordinated removal of inconvenient traces. Elias extracted stills, cataloged timestamps, and compared gait and posture for identifying traits. Organized actors were moving to shape the scene. That truth narrowed his options. A retired clerk met him behind a modest house and slid photocopies across a weathered table. Pages showed odd transfers, an unexplained advance, and a looped signature echoing seals found in the hatch. The man spoke haltingly about pages removed during administrative changes and favors exchanged to close records neatly. The photocopies fit the pattern Elias was building: access, motive, concealment. The clerk's candor trembled with memory of bargains made under quiet pressure. Elias folded the copies into his packet and planned corroboration beyond town channel. To probe without provoking, he posted a neutral request on the community notice board, asking for information about unusual vehicle movements near the ravine, phrasing the note as civic concern and allowing anonymity. The tactic aimed to reveal ears more than to accuse. A reply would expose fissures while silence itself would speak. The board remained blank, and the emptiness registered as data, the absence of tips as informative as a confession. Night returned with engines closer, headlights sweeping like knives. Elias and Varg took cover among ferns while he triggered a pre-arranged warning, a thin alarm note and a flaring light calibrated to disorient. Men scattered, one cursed and stumbled. The brief skirmish produced a loose bundle wrapped in oilcloth and a sealed folder left at a seam where intruders had worked. Elias moved under the cover of darkness, recovered documents in a small sealed envelope, bagged each item, and marked coordinates. He did not pursue reckless confrontation. He prioritized evidence preservation and escape routes. He prepared a secure packet for Agent Laura Tate, attaching photographs, stills, and a catalog of recovered items with chain of custody details and timestamp. Contacting outside authority would change local dynamics and could provoke pushback, but outside involvement offered legal weight beyond local capture. Sending the packet felt like tossing a rope into rough water. Help might arrive, or the act might escalate resistance. Still he pressed send, because truth had weighed and because someone deserved answers. Throughout these hours, Elias rehearsed contingencies with the gravity of someone who had survived plans gone wrong. He identified witnesses who might speak privately, arranged for Clara to copy sensitive documents discreetly, and established off-site caches for originals. He rotated communication channels, stored encrypted backups, and memorized passphrase. Each precaution reduced the chance that a sudden sweep could erase months of careful work. Varg steadied him. The dog slept with head on Elias's boot, breathing warmth into a cold night and reminding him that loyalty endured where systems sometimes fail. In that small shared silence, Elias thought about courage and endurance, about pursuing truth against forces that preferred ignorance. He sat then, and wrote a message he would later post, not as bravado, but as an invitation to solidarity, a plain question and an earnest request for stories of perseverance. The act of asking connected him to strangers beyond Harmony Creek's careful hush and widened the audience that might care. Plans lay ahead: corroborate records, secure outside oversight, approach implicated names with legal precision, so institutional weight would follow documented fact, and move to avoid giving advantage to those who would erase evidence. Above all, he promised Varg he would not back away from truth, whatever cost it required. Ever felt like someone was watching you, trying to stop you from uncovering the truth? Let us know how you pushed through in the comments. Elias and Varg returned to the hollow before sunrise, the woods wrapped in a pale, patient mist that muffled sound and lent their movements a secretive hush. Frost rimmed a metal seam, and flashed when his light cut through gray. His breath came steady as strategy. Varg stayed 2 steps behind, muscles coiled, nostrils tasting history, ears rotating like tuned instruments to small changes in wind and timber. The hatch yielded little by indifference. Rust resisted with teeth of salt and time. Elias moved like a man unlearning hurry, each motion measured to preserve context, to leave evidence where it might later mean something. Once the lid shifted, a stale air spilled out, carrying oil and old paper, and a sour undercurrent that set his teeth on edge. He trained a lamp inside and cataloged with methodical calm, photographing every angle, numbering artifacts as he worked. Beneath the bent console, his gloved fingers brushed something rigid and pale. He cleared away matted fabric and loam, until the outline resolved into bone, an edge of a rib, calcified and brittle, its curve whispering of a life interrupted. Elias inhaled shallowly, tasting salt and an old grief, and set the fragment aside in a sealed bag with an evidence tag. Nearby he found spent casings, flattened and corroded, their makers' stamps flickering like fingerprints under grit. One bore markings that matched models deployed by certain security contractors and municipal reserves in the late 80s. He cataloged caliber and maker and cross-referenced them mentally against the notes Clara had shown him in the library. Fabric strands clung to twisted metal, remnants of clothing fused with silt. A warped belt buckle came free in his gloved palm, its face stamped faintly with a partial emblem. He photographed each find at multiple exposures, aware that light revealed truth as much as it hid it. Deeper inside the compartment, at an angle that suggested intentional concealment, a panel under the driver's seat came loose under a pried screwdriver. Elias eased it aside and found a shallow vault cut into the vehicle's floor. The cavity contained bundles wrapped in oilcloth, edges stained but sealing contents against damp. He worked careful hands, sliced twine and peeled back layers, until stacks of currency lay exposed. Broad bands, holding packs of notes numbered by hand. Even in the dim, the texture and tone spoke obviousness. Cash stacked with the discipline of someone who expected to return. He counted slowly, mindful of accuracy and chain of custody, and the total settled like a stone, roughly $1.5 million. The arrangement suggested intent rather than accident, a deliberate concealment waiting for retrieval. The presence of such cash in a vehicle, buried deep in federal forest land, changed the equation. Where legitimate transport used manifests and insurers, this hidden cash hinted at payoffs, hush money, or a business that preferred untraceable barter to formal accounts. Elias considered motives and the bitter arithmetic of people who valued silence above law. A bone fragment beside currency narrowed his hypothesis to something darker than fiscal scheme, violence that had been wrapped in calculation and then buried. He set the lighter beside an open notebook, and turned his attention back to the initials stamped into brass. SH was not merely a curiosity once cross-referenced. Clara's careful microfilm had exposed the same curl of letters on municipal forms and ledger entries. Elias scrolled through digitized newspapers and scanned ledgers on his tablet, eyes moving fast across cramped type. He found a payroll stub from a security company dated near the reported disappearance, and a bill of lading with annotations that suggested unofficial handling. A later line item showed a contractor receiving an unusual advance. Property records reflected sudden purchases by a company with obscured ownership. The name that recurred as beneficiary or associate in the months after 1987 pointed to a former deputy whose public biography had morphed into private prosperity. The pattern assembled into an ugly architecture: access, motive, and mechanisms for concealment. A man with influence could reroute shipments, delay reports, and smooth over paperwork. Money laundered into property and shell companies could mask origin while enriching those positioned to benefit. Holt's name surfaced in deeds and bank notations, associate signatures recurring like echoes on different forms. The lighter's initials threaded the metal hull to inked names, and to ledger entries that shifted comfort into conspicuous advantage. Elias documented every crosslink, saving encrypted copies and distributing duplicates to trusted channels. He cataloged serial numbers, photographed stamped seals, and noted dates beside coordinates. He compiled evidence into numbered packets to preserve chain of custody and moved originals to weatherproof bags. Clara agreed to retain copies at the library in a misfiled stack to buy time. A retired clerk provided photocopies of documents that had been altered in municipal shuffles. Piecing these fragments together produced more than implication. It produced a documentary skeleton that suggested orchestration, not happenstance. Elias understood the social geometry at play: a town that had learned to compromise quietly, a network where favors bought smiles, and a public face that could obscure private transgression. The hollow trembled as distant diesel rolled across ridgelines and tire patterns chewed at dirt. Varg's body coiled like a spring. The dog planted his weight at Elias's knee, and emitted a low, precise growl that cut through the cold. They worked faster but not carelessly, bagging evidence and clipping tags, leaving markers intended to guide investigators rather than to bait confrontation. Elias knew organized teams could return to sanitize the scene, to reclaim what they believed belonged solely to them. He also understood that hasty engagement could cost lives. Engines drew nearer, a sound that narrowed from rumor to threat, and Elias slid the last sealed packet into a protective case. He tucked the lighter into an inner pocket, and slotted the bone fragment into a separate bag, mindful of contamination. Varg skirted the hollow, ears forward, ready to move at a single word. Elias glanced once more at the mangled safe, and at the pattern of shell casings that suggested close-range conflict, and a sorrow like a weight settled over him, evidence that money had been purchased at human cost. He closed the hatch with deliberate hands, restoring a fragile silence with care, and moved uphill to a concealed ridge where he could watch while remaining unseen. There he set a low-powered camera aimed at the hollow, and prepared a secure packet for outside authority. He uploaded select images and contextual notes to an encrypted line, and pinged Agent Laura Tate with coordinates, timestamps, and brief annotations designed to convey both urgency and corroboration. Sending evidence beyond Harmony Creek would summon official resources that local influence might not easily sway, but it also risked provoking swift, organized pushback. Varg sat at his feet as diesel lights skittered through timber below, and a convoy slowed to a crawl where the ravine opened. Elias tightened his pack straps, slid deeper into shadow, and watched as men moved with purpose toward the hollow, believing they could reclaim what they had once buried. He breathed slow and steady, feeling the weight of responsibility settle beside him like an old friend, and braced for the choices that would follow. Elias heard gravel give beneath approaching tires, before headlights carved the ravine mouth. Two SUVs moved with deliberate caution. Silhouettes practiced against night, commands snapped, boots scuffed, and purpose felt organized. He settled into habit, assess, wrote, evade, and mapped a plan without panic. Varg flattened low, nostrils quivering, muscles ready. He kept to shadow and watched as men stepped from vehicles, tools glinting. One vehicle snagged a cable. An oath split the air as it lurched, giving Elias a narrow advantage. A flashlight swung. A figure lunged forward with a handgun. In a single controlled burst, Varg struck, teeth clamping a thigh to bring a man down without mortal force. The handler cried out. His weapon skidded away. The bite bought time, not victory. Elias slunk into a low cave mouth that slurred sound and offered cover. He unrolled a compact satellite modem and brought a rugged tablet to life, fingers steady as ritual, assembling a packet of photographs, coordinates, and notes. He transmitted images and concise annotations to Agent Laura Tate, adding timestamps that framed discoveries as evidence. The canopy created interference, but the link held long enough to register receipt and promise of response. Outside lamps swept trunks and underbrush. Voices mapped search lanes that tightened like a net. Elias moved through tributaries and deer runs, choosing routes that would muffle scent and confuse pursuit. He set tripwires at ankle height, tied to soft alarms fashioned from tin and string. The devices would disorient origin rather than maim. He threaded natural choke points with care so Varg could intercede where needed, without exposing them to direct confrontation. At a narrow splice in a logging road, Elias paused to stash a sealed envelope containing extracted fragments and photographs in a hollow stump sealed with resin. Redundancy mattered. Copies went to remote storage into Clara, while originals remained hidden in caches. He preferred not to fight openly. His aim was preservation of proof that would hold up beyond rumor. Varg nosed the site, satisfied, and they moved uphill into thicker pine. Pursuers tightened the grid and lights flared closer. A searcher tripped a wire and cursed as his ankle snagged. The commotion bought an interval Elias used to cross a gullied slope and climb a mossy bluff. Hands profited from memory. The shapes of routes he had walked before gave footholds obscured to newcomers. He watched a man struggle as colleagues cut snare lines and argued whether to widen the sweep. Argument delayed movement. Delay widened margin for escape. Rain threatened. Threads of mist gathering in hollows, and engines hummed like beasts tuned to a low frequency. Elias rotated approaches to confuse scent and blurred footprints across old skid lines. He used watercourses to erase tread patterns, and fed decoy tracks toward deadfalls to mislead searchers. Varg remained eerily quiet and precise, intercepting a runner who tried to flank their line. Elias tied a soft restraint and left the man bound and alive in brush. The act slowed pursuit without lethal consequence. In the dark, a convoy crossed a skyline. Heads dipped, lamps painted the cloud. Elias crouched beneath rock outcrops and watched the figures pass, counting them and noting vehicle types. He adjusted path toward a cave system he had scouted earlier, narrowing entries to force pursuers into known channels where movement looked conspicuous. He moved with the economy of someone comfortable surviving on small margins. Dawn lightened the eastern ridges and engines receded as teams regrouped at staging point. Elias allowed a breath and surveyed losses and gains. A man bitten and slowed, evidence caches intact in a list of identifiers, vehicle impressions, muffled license fragments, accents heard in commands that would help later identification. He compiled a precise field report for Agent Tate, sticking to observable facts, vehicle descriptions, times, audio snippets, and photographic stills. He avoided speculation, keeping each line defensible and focused on verifiable detail. By midday, he retrieved sealed envelopes and recovered items from caches, cleaning and photographing each artifact anew. The man Varg had bitten had been borne off by cohorts, his identity uncertain. Elias organized files, encrypted backups and duplicates to trusted contacts. A call came in from a federal liaison, confirming that regional units had been informed. Relief arrived like a cautious tide, assistance promised but not immediate. When deputies from outside the county finally met him at a roadside clearing, Elias handed over a packet with careful notes. They inspected images, logged serial numbers, and asked precise questions about timing and chain of custody. Elias stayed exact and patient. Legal process demanded it. He watched faces as details sank in, feeling official interest shift the balance in ways his solo actions could not. He had forced the case above the town's immediate influence. He let himself relax only marginally. Varg licked a hand and settled warm weight against a knee. Elias kept moving, arranging witness contacts with Clara and a retired clerk, plotting depositions and secure transfers to attorney oversight. He understood consequences. Escalating to federal probes would provoke resistance from those with vested interest. Still, Proof had been protected and a chain of custody established. That was the hard currency of accountability. Exhaustion pooled deep, but practical tasks kept him functional, logging statements, preserving evidence and preparing secure transmissions for prosecute. He reflected on small mercies, Varg's fidelity, Clara's courage in copying documents, and a retired clerk's willingness to speak. Those acts stitched together a form of communal courage that would be necessary to unmoor the town's buried secret. As afternoon settled, Elias watched the ravine from a ridge, sun striking waking leaves. He understood that pursuit might return in force and that legal process would be slow and brutal, but the path forward had shifted. Outside oversight could not be folded by local favor. He buttoned his jacket, slung a pack across a shoulder, and walked away with Varg at heel, ready for what came next. Night pressed close and Elias matched uplink timestamps to distant engine patterns, using those markers to predict staging zones where vehicles gathered and where pursuers might consolidate their search efforts. He crossed open clearings and angled along wind corridors to confuse scent, placing caches in hollow trunks and in rocky clefts before routing decoy tracks toward old logging lines to mislead trackers. At one pass he crouched beneath a hung boulder, counted occupants on a skyline, noted vehicle silhouettes and recorded clipped commands, then adjusted course toward a cave system mapped earlier in his solitary. He transmitted a concise field dossier to Agent Tate, attaching photographic stills, audio snippets and precise coordinates, and she replied with terse acknowledgement that regional teams were mobilizing to investigate the ravine. Federal liaisons arrived with deliberate caution, photographed evidence caches, sealed materials for chain of custody, and asked straight questions about timing, signatures and who might possess keys to unlocked doors. Relief arrived measured but real. Elias kept duplicating files, securing originals off-site, and arranging witness statements so that legal pressure could not be easily neutralized by local influence, or by those who profited from a long-buried crime. Have you ever had to run from danger to protect the truth? Share your courage in the comments. It might inspire someone.
Elias prepared bait with meticulous care, a single photograph of the lighter's initials attached to a concise note sent to a local blogger whose posts stirred old towns. He used a masked account and phrased the message compel curiosity rather than to indict, knowing that in Harmony Creek reputation moved faster than confession. Night compressed the woods into an ink wash. Elias dressed in soft boots and dark clothing, set discreet tripwires rigged to small alarms and blinding panels, then positioned himself on a concealed ridge with a clear view of the hollow. Varg padded at his side, senses attuned and ready. The plan relied on disruption and documentation rather than violence. Disorient intruders, isolate leaders, and force exposure. At 11:58 the blogger posted the image, and a short commentary that rippled through town. Holt responded the only way a man who had kept profit and power could, by arriving. He stepped from a black SUV at midnight, flanked by two vehicles, men moving with practiced quiet. Boots scuffed leaf litter, flashlights probed lines. Holt's presence carried the blunt weight of someone accustomed to decisions that bent others into silence. The first tripwire tripped. A sharp pop, then a scatter of light that turned searchers toward noise. Varg lunged with trained speed, intercepting a man who had moved to the hatch. The dog's teeth found a leg and brought the man down, precise enough to disable without killing. Alarms clattered. Men cursed and staggered. Elias watched shadows disconnect and reform like puppets on strings. He stepped into view when Holt leveled a pistol with a slow arrogance. Elias used measured tones to speak facts rather than taunts. He listed discoveries plainly: bone fragments, counted bundles of cash, shell casings, the lighter stamped with initials. He displayed ledger matches and municipal stamps tied to signatures. Each item was evidence, each image catalogued. Holt's face flickered between practiced composure and a flicker of something like panic when ledgers were read aloud beside photographs. Holt responded with the same old denials, then with brittle laughter meant to mask collapse. He spun rationalizations about misfiled paperwork and innocent transactions. Elias countered with precise dates and scanned copies. He read aloud a line that tied a contractor payment to a deed transfer. Holt's jaw tightened and a hand trembled where it clutched a cigarette. The forest seemed to hold its breath as a man schooled in bribery and command lost ground under the weight of documents. When words failed to hold, Holt's guard slipped into confession, clipped and angry. He admitted a scheme arranged through trusted officers, an interception, threats to keep guards silent, concealment of bodies, then the distribution of cash into holdings disguised by shell companies. He recited details as if telling an old plan rather than confessing sin, but his voice carried the crack of someone naming what he had once ordered, buried. The admission hung in night air thick as mist. Elias recorded every syllable. He let Holt speak until the man's sentences folded into full admission, and until the surrounding witnesses shifted. Some watches lowered eyes, others flinched as alliances recomputed. Holt's admission, captured with photographic evidence at the hollow, would be a hard node in any legal narrative. Elias had arranged for that exact outcome. Exposure in a place where law could see, not just rumor. By the time agents' headlights carved through trees, Holt's men were disoriented and exposed. Federal officers moved with deliberate protocol, read rights, secure weapons, and isolate participants. Agent Laura Tate stepped from a vehicle and surveyed the scene with professional calm. She snapped cuffs on Holt and rifled through files as if closing a book. Holt's empire, constructed on favors, hush payments, and silenced fear, began to collapse into charges and seizure notices. Elias handed over packets detailing chains of custody, timestamps, and copies of every item. Agents cataloged shell casings, photographed a mangled safe, and recorded the lighter alongside ledger images. Holt's men shuffled, answering questions with guarded defensiveness that crumbled when cross-referenced by documents already in federal hands. The law moved in procedural increments that felt slow to some, but decisive in their documentation and admissibility. As Holt was taken away, the expression on his face changed from command to something closer to regret. The power he had wielded returned to paper and vaults. Accounts were frozen, properties flagged, and attorneys arrived to negotiate. Harmony Creek would not remain untouched. Questions proliferated in diners and porches. Roy Baxter fielded uneasy customers, whose small talk carried the weight of dawning disbelief. Clara organized copies of files and extended her testimony to agents, aligning dates, names, and microfilm clippings that reinforced what had been found at the hollow. A retired clerk provided corroborating photocopies that sealed municipal involvement. These local acts of courage, stitched together with federal procedure, created a structure that would support prosecution beyond rumor and local influence. Dawn found Elias and Varg atop a bluff where mist lifted from the hills like a curtain. The town's silhouette revealed a place waking into complicated light. Faces that had once avoided certain subjects, now gathered in clusters, ideas and excuses colliding with the evidence. Elias felt a hard relief and a wary calm. Justice had begun, but the process would be long and fraught. He slid a hand down Varg's flank and thought of the guards who would finally get names, and perhaps some measure of closure. Agents moved through the hollow methodically, securing items and pulling records for warrants. Holt's arrest had sent ripples that could not be smoothed by old favors. Legal teams and investigative units would unravel shell pathways and trace funds. Audits and subpoenas would follow. Families of the missing guards would find steps toward answers they had been denied for decades. Elias stayed long enough to ensure chain of custody remained intact, and then retreated as agents took statements and organized transport. He watched Holt loaded into a transport vehicle, hands bound, surrounded by officers, and felt the fragile satisfaction of truth upheld by evidence rather than rumor. He thought of Harmony Creek's future, a town that would have to decide whether to reckon or to slowly mend its fractures without naming them, and of how truth sometimes demanded patience and persistence more than spectacle. In the weeks that followed, prosecutions unfolded. Subpoenas reached bank vaults, auditors traced transfers through shadow accounts, and small confessions surfaced, shifting local power. Some who had guarded silence chose to speak, while others retreated into private shame, making room for fragile truth to take root finally. Ever faced someone who thought they were untouchable? Tell us how justice prevailed in your life below. Dawn lifted slowly over the Ozarks, as pale light unwound mist from hilly ridges, revealing swaths of maple, oak, and fir cooled by night. Elias stood with Varg at his side on a bluff that looked down across the valley, where they had unearthed truth. The air tasted like iron and new rain, a clean bite that felt less like weather than like reckoning. He watched fog fingers fold back into cedar stands and noticed dew sliding from leaf to soil, carrying away the hush that had covered decades. Varg nosed his palm, warm and sure, an anchor that had steadied him through nights of cold and runs where breath fogged like confession. The dog's coat still held last traces of frost, and his eyes tracked each movement with the quiet intelligence born of partnership. He thought of the two guards whose absences had created hollows in other lives, wives who set extra places at tables, sons who learned to say names without expecting return, mothers who softened stories so grief would not tear daily rhythms. He pictured families receiving a call and letters that explained where silence had lived for decades. The bundles recovered from the hollow would change anonymous loss into tangible accounting. Money could not replace life, but it could return dignity and provide answers, and help settle practical needs left unsettled for years. Solitude had been his refuge in the Ozarks, a place to distance himself from uniformed noise and the memory of war. The woods offered rhythm and a metronome for breath, but isolation risked calcifying grief into numbness. Varg broke that tendency, demanding action through quiet insistence. Partnership shifted Elias from retreat to resolve. The dog's fidelity turned private ache into public responsibility. Together they chose to uncover rather than to let rot remain under root and leaf. After arrests, progress felt deliberate and procedural. Agents photographed the hollow, cataloged shell casings, and sealed items into numbered packets with chain of custody tags. Families met investigators with a mix of relief and exhaustion as officials read lists aloud, confirmed names, and advised on recovery of remains. Clara organized copies of microfilm and municipal documents, arranging materials so prosecutors could trace funds and signatures without relying on brittle memory. Roy received awkward apologies from acquaintances who had once avoided the subject, and his diner filled with patrons whose conversations now bore the weight of new facts. Elias visited households flagged for notification, keeping language precise and spare. He sat across kitchen tables warmed by sunlight and read lines from files, watching how hands reacted when history matched private memory. Sometimes names closed a wound, offering accountable fact where a void had existed. Sometimes facts opened new questions whose edges needed careful tending. He listened more than he spoke and treated each pause as a hinge. Truth arrived irregularly and demanded gentle handling. He returned repeatedly to the hollow to answer investigators' questions and to ensure original evidence remained secure. He walked ridges to point out vantage lines and paths used during pursuit, sketching maps from memory for agents unfamiliar with local contours. In offices and preliminary hearings, he learned to translate field discipline into testimony shaped for legal scrutiny. Dates, times, chain of custody, photographic anchor, sitting through motions and affidavits, gave him a patient appreciation for process and for the slow work that transforms rumor into record. Harmony Creek did not revert to old quiet. Conversations shifted and neighbors debated the town's future, divided between those clinging to loyalty and those welcoming clarity. Institutions adjusted as permits were re-examined, contracts audited, and signatures scrutinized. Things once trusted were reframed as choices needing explanation. Public order revealed a cost when generated by concealment. The town learned that maintaining peace sometimes required uncomfortable conversation and a willingness to re-examine past decisions. Elias found himself writing again after years of silence. He filled a small notebook with observations that were neither reports nor private journals, but a hybrid practice that steadied attention. He noted weather along creek beds, routes that remained practical for travel, and small conversational details that might later prove useful. Writing became a way to slot chaos into sentences he could return to, and the practice eased his sense of drift and sharpened memory into usable traits. Publicly he spoke at a meeting, organized to address civic responsibility, the cost of silence, and the value of transparency. He did not aim to indict anonymously, but to explain process and to encourage accountability. Teenagers listened closely and elders offered memories shaded by omission. Clara and the retired clerk sometimes joined him, their quiet corroboration underscoring that truth required multiple keepers willing to place facts above fear. Varg remained the same steady companion, uninterested in recognition and content with ordinary routines. The dog accepted meals, naps, and long walks, offering a simple fidelity that often mattered more than public thanks. Small acknowledgments surfaced, a note at the library, a brief mention in a regional paper, a neighbor leaving a plate at the diner. Those gestures stitched social fabric in ways paperwork could not. Apology, shared meal, and legal work continued as subpoenas and audits peeled back layers. Holt faced charges that matched documentary evidence and witness testimony, while assets froze and investigators traced transfers through shell accounts. Some local figures cooperated when confronted by officials beyond local influence. Others withdrew behind counsel. Law moved slowly, favoring documentation and cross-checks over furious declarations. But its meticulous pace promised durability and outcomes rather than the fleeting drama of rumor. Elias watched progress without mistaking motion for closure. He knew grief could not be erased by legal remedy. Memorials and restitution could not rebuild lost lives. Yet practical consequences mattered. Families received restitution, records amended, and a public ledger formed that could not be silently rewritten. Those outcomes returned some dignity to people who had been pushed into silence, and offered a framework for accountability. Months later, Elias and Varg returned to the bluff where the story had begun. Light slanted through thinning clouds and warmed the ground beneath their boots. He put a hand on Varg's flank and felt the steady press of fur and muscle, an anchor reminding him that companion animals shape human resolve in ways no paper file could. They looked out over a town altered but breathing, a landscape holding both scar and slow recovery. If Elias and Varg's courage moved you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of truth and triumph. Like, share, and comment to join our community. Your support brings these tales to life. Your engagement sustains independent storytellers and helps bring hidden injustices into daylight where accountability can begin today. Support meaningful storytelling by subscribing, sharing episodes with friends, and leaving comments that encourage accountability and community conversation across borders today.